I never believed in ghosts or paranormal activity. I'm the type of person who needs hard evidence before I'll even consider something might be real. But what happened to me during my freshman year of college completely changed my perspective on things I can't explain. I was attending a small liberal arts school in upstate New York, one of those old institutions that's been around since the 1800s. The campus was beautiful, all brick buildings and sprawling lawns, but there was something undeniably eerie about it, especially at night. I lived in Morrison Hall, which was one of the oldest dormitories on campus. The building had this reputation for being haunted, but I didn't pay attention to any of that nonsense. Every old building has ghost stories. It's just part of the charm, right? My roommate Tyler was the complete opposite of me. He was obsessed with the paranormal and spent way too much time watching ghost hunting shows and reading about supposed hauntings. When he found out Morrison Hall had a history, he was thrilled. I thought it was ridiculous. The stories about our dorm were pretty standard as far as ghost tales go. Supposedly, back in the 1920s, a student had hanged himself in one of the third-floor rooms after failing out of school. People claimed to hear footsteps in the hallway at night, doors opening and closing on their own, that sort of thing. Tyler ate it up. I rolled my eyes. Things started getting weird about 2 months into the semester. I was pulling an all-nighter studying for a biology exam, and Tyler had gone home for the weekend to visit his family. It was around 3 a.m., and I was alone in our room on the second floor. The building was dead silent, which made sense considering it was the middle of the night on a Friday. Most people were either asleep or out partying. I was hunched over my desk, caffeine coursing through my veins, when I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like someone wearing boots. They were coming from the direction of the stairwell and moving slowly down the corridor toward my room. I didn't think much of it at first. Probably just another student coming back from somewhere. But then the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I waited for a knock or for whoever it was to keep walking, but nothing happened. Just silence. After about 30 seconds, I got up and looked through the peephole. The hallway was completely empty. I opened the door and stuck my head out, looking both ways. Nobody. The entire corridor was deserted. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, or that whoever it was had ducked into another room. I went back to studying, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. About an hour later, it happened again. The same heavy footsteps coming down the hallway, stopping right outside my door. This time I immediately jumped up and yanked the door open. Nothing, nobody there. The hallway was empty and silent. I stood there for a minute, my heart pounding, before slowly closing the door and locking it. I tried to go back to studying, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound made me jump. When Tyler came back on Sunday, I told him what had happened. His eyes lit up like I'd just given him the best news of his life. He immediately started going on about how it was probably the ghost, how I'd experienced a real paranormal encounter. I told him he was being ridiculous, that there had to be a logical explanation. But deep down, I was starting to wonder. The footsteps became a regular occurrence after that. Always around 3 a.m., always the same pattern. They'd come down the hallway, stop outside our door, and then nothing. It happened at least 3 or 4 times a week. Tyler started staying up to try to catch it on his phone, but whenever he was awake and waiting, nothing would happen. It only seemed to occur when I was alone or when both of us were asleep. One night, about a month after the footsteps started, something else happened. I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m., which had become my new internal alarm clock apparently. Tyler was snoring in his bed across the room. I lay there in the darkness, waiting to hear if the footsteps would come. They did. The same heavy, deliberate sound, moving down the hallway. But this time they didn't stop at our door. I heard them continue past, fading away toward the end of the corridor. Then I heard a door open and close. I sat up in bed, straining to hear anything else. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Then I heard it. A chair dragging across the floor in the room above us. Then footsteps directly overhead, pacing back and forth. The room above us was supposed to be empty. It had been vacant all semester because of some water damage that maintenance was supposedly fixing. I knew this because Tyler had tried to break in once to investigate, thinking it might be where the ghost activity was strongest. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to navigate across the room. I shook Tyler awake, and he groggily asked what was wrong. I pointed at the ceiling and whispered for him to listen. We both sat there in silence, and sure enough, the footsteps continued overhead. Slow, methodical pacing from one end of the room to the other. Tyler was wide awake now, his eyes huge. He grabbed his phone and started recording audio. We listened to those footsteps for almost 20 minutes before they finally stopped. The next morning, we went to the third floor to investigate. The door to the room above ours was locked, and when we peeked through the small window, we could see the room was completely empty except for some construction equipment and plastic sheeting. There was no way someone could have been in there. We reported it to our Ra, who seemed annoyed that we were bothering him about ghost stories. He assured us that no one had access to that room except maintenance, and maintenance didn't work at 3 a.m. Tyler was convinced we made contact with the spirit. I was still trying to rationalize it, but I was running out of logical explanations. Things escalated about a week later. I was alone again, studying late at night. Tyler had fallen asleep around midnight. I was at my desk, working on an essay, when I felt this overwhelming sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this horrible feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. I slowly turned around, and that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, partially obscured by shadow, was the figure of a man. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but I could see that he was looking directly at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there, frozen, staring at this impossible thing in our room. We made eye contact, or at least I think we did, and I felt this wave of intense sadness wash over me. It wasn't my sadness. It was coming from him, this overwhelming despair and hopelessness. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. I jumped up, turned on every light in the room, and shook Tyler awake. I was shaking and could barely get the words out. Tyler, to his credit, didn't say "I told you so." He just sat with me for the rest of the night while I tried to calm down. The next day, we went to the library and started researching the history of Morrison Hall. We found old yearbooks and newspaper archives, trying to find information about the supposed suicide in the 1920s. It took us hours, but we finally found it. His name was James Morrison, and he'd been a junior studying literature. The newspaper article from 1923 was brief but heartbreaking. He'd been found in his dorm room after failing to show up for classes for 3 days. The article mentioned that he'd been struggling academically and had been despondent about disappointing his family. The room number listed in the article was 312, the room directly above ours. We also discovered something else. James Morrison wasn't just any student. The building had been named after his family, who had been major donors to the school. His death had been hushed up as much as possible to avoid scandal. After learning all this, I felt differently about the whole situation. I wasn't scared anymore. I was sad. This wasn't some malevolent entity trying to harm us. It was just a kid, not much older than we were, who'd been so overwhelmed by pressure and despair that he'd taken his own life. And apparently, some part of him was still here, still trapped in that moment. I decided to try something that night. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt like I needed to do it. I waited until 3 a.m., and when I heard the footsteps coming down the hallway, I opened my door. I stood in the doorway and spoke out loud. I told James that I knew who he was, that I knew what had happened to him, and that I was sorry. I told him that it was okay to let go, that he didn't have to stay here anymore. The footsteps had stopped right in front of me, even though I couldn't see anyone there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, feeling ridiculous, but also feeling like it was the right thing to do. Then I felt that same wave of sadness I'd experienced before, but this time it was mixed with something else. Relief, maybe, or gratitude. After that night, the footsteps stopped. The feeling of being watched went away. Tyler and I lived in that room for the rest of the year, and we never experienced anything paranormal again. I don't know if what I did actually helped James move on, or if it was all just coincidence. But I choose to believe that maybe, just maybe, I helped someone who'd been suffering for almost a century finally find peace. I still don't know if I believe in ghosts in the traditional sense, but I know what I experienced was real, and I know that there are things in this world that can't be easily explained by logic and reason. Morrison Hall was demolished 2 years ago to make room for a new student center. I hope that wherever James is now, He's finally free. This happened when I was working as a night security guard at a storage facility just outside of Portland. I was 24 at the time and had just moved to Oregon after dropping out of grad school. I needed money fast, and security work was easy to get into without much experience. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to cover rent and food while I figured out what I wanted to do with my life. The storage facility was massive, probably 200 units spread across 5 buildings. My job was simple. Drive around the property every hour, check that all the gates and units were locked, and make sure no one was trying to break in. Most nights were boring as hell. I'd spend my time listening to podcasts and playing games on my phone between rounds. The facility had been there for decades, and it looked it. The buildings were old and rundown, with flickering lights and narrow corridors between units. During the day, it was just dingy and depressing. At night, it was genuinely creepy. I'd been working there for about 3 months when I started noticing something odd. Unit 247 in Building C always had its light on. Not the overhead fluorescent lights that lit the corridors, but a light coming from inside the unit itself, visible through the gap at the bottom of the door. Storage units aren't supposed to have electricity. They're just empty concrete boxes with roll-up metal doors. There's no wiring, no outlets, nothing. But every night when I did my rounds, I could see light seeping out from under that door. I mentioned it to my supervisor, a gruff older guy named Rick who'd been working there forever. He said it was probably just a reflection or light from outside bouncing weird off the metal door. I didn't buy it, but I didn't push the issue. Then one night, I heard something coming from that unit. I was doing my midnight round, walking through Building C with my flashlight, when I heard what sounded like music. It was faint, barely audible, but it was definitely coming from Unit 247. I stopped in front of the door and listened. It was old-timey music, like something from the 1940s or 50s. Big band stuff, with horns and a crooning male vocalist. I pressed my ear against the metal door, and I could hear it more clearly. There was also another sound underneath the music, shuffling, like someone moving around inside. My first thought was that someone was squatting in the unit. It happened occasionally at storage facilities. People who were homeless or down on their luck would break into a unit and use it as a temporary shelter. I radioed Rick and told him what I was hearing. He sounded annoyed, but said he'd come check it out. When Rick arrived about 20 minutes later, I took him to Unit 247. But when we got there was no music, no light under the door, nothing. Rick gave me this look like I was wasting his time. He checked the lock, which was secure, and told me I was probably just hearing things from another unit or from outside. Sound could travel weird in these buildings, he said. I felt like an idiot, but I knew what I'd heard. After Rick left, I continued my rounds, but I couldn't stop thinking about that unit. I decided to look it up in the system when I got back to the office. Every unit had a record with the renter's information, rental history, payment status, all that stuff. When I pulled up Unit 247, something was immediately wrong. The renter's name was listed as Harold Gaines, and according to the system, he'd been renting the unit since 1987. That was over 30 years of continuous rental. But here's the thing. The monthly payment was listed as $15. Even accounting for inflation and the fact that prices were lower back then, $15 seemed impossibly cheap. Current rates for that size unit were around $150 a month. I dug deeper into the records. Harold Gaines had never missed a payment. Every single month for over 30 years, like clockwork, $15 was paid. But there was no payment method listed. No credit card, no bank account, no checks. Just a note that said cash payment received. I tried to find more information about Harold Gaines, but there was nothing. No phone number, no email, no address except for a P.O. box that probably didn't exist anymore. It was like he was a ghost. The next night, I went back to Unit 247 during my midnight round. Sure enough, there was light under the door again, and I could hear that same old music playing. This time I took out my phone and recorded a video, making sure to capture the light and the audio. I wasn't going to let Rick tell me I was imagining things again. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. The music continued, and I could definitely hear movement inside. It sounded like someone was pacing back and forth, their footsteps slow and deliberate. Then the music stopped, just cut off mid-song. The light under the door went out. I stood there in the darkness, my heart pounding. Then I heard 3 loud bangs on the inside of the door, right at my head level. It scared me so badly that I stumbled backward and nearly fell. I got the hell out of that building and spent the rest of my shift in the office, watching the security cameras. Building C had cameras at both entrances, but none in the corridors where the units were. I watched those feeds for hours, and no one entered or left the building. The next day, I showed Rick the video I'd recorded. He watched it with a skeptical expression, but I could tell it bothered him. The light was clearly visible, and the music was audible on the recording. He said he'd look into it, and told me not to worry about it. A few days later, Rick pulled me aside and told me that he'd contacted the owner about Unit 247. Apparently, the owner had inherited the facility from his father, who'd inherited it from his father. The arrangement with Harold Gaines went back to the original owner, and it was supposed to be honored in perpetuity. Rick didn't know the details, and the current owner didn't either. It was just one of those old agreements that had been grandfathered in over the years. Rick told me to just ignore the unit and not to bother whoever or whatever was in there. That didn't sit right with me. I became obsessed with figuring out what was going on. I spent my nights researching, trying to find any information about Harold Gaines. I searched obituaries, public records, property records, everything. Finally, I found something. A death certificate from 1994 for a Harold Gaines, aged 67, who died of a heart attack. The address listed was in Portland, not far from the storage facility. Harold Gaines had been dead for over 20 years. But according to the facility's records, he'd been paying rent for his unit every single month since then. Someone or something was still making those payments. I decided I needed to get inside that unit. I knew it was probably illegal and definitely against company policy, but I had to know what was in there. I waited until a night when Rick wasn't working, and I grabbed the master key from the office. My hands were shaking as I approached Unit 247 around 2 a.m. The light was on under the door, and I could hear that music playing again. I took a deep breath, unlocked the padlock, and slowly rolled up the metal door. The music stopped immediately. The unit was completely empty. No furniture, no boxes, no lights, no radio. Nothing, just bare concrete walls and floor. But I could feel something. The air inside was freezing cold, despite it being a warm summer night. And there was this smell, like old paper and mothballs. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. That's when I saw it. On the back wall, someone had written in what looked like chalk. The message said, "Thank you for respecting my privacy. Please close the door." The handwriting was shaky and old-fashioned. I stood there, staring at those words, and I felt that same presence I'd sensed before. I wasn't alone in that unit. I couldn't see anyone, but something was definitely there with me. I backed out slowly, lowered the door, and locked it. I never opened that unit again. I quit the job 2 weeks later. I couldn't handle being there anymore, knowing what I knew. Before I left, I tried one more time to find information about Harold Gaines. I finally tracked down an old newspaper article from 1994 about his death. The article mentioned that he'd been a veteran who'd struggled with mental illness after returning from Vietnam. He'd lived alone and had few friends or family. The article also mentioned that he'd been evicted from his apartment shortly before his death and had been living out of a storage unit. He'd died in that unit, Unit 247. The facility had apparently kept it quiet to avoid bad publicity. They'd found his body during a routine inspection, and by then he'd been dead for almost a week. I don't know what I experienced in that storage facility. Maybe it was Harold's ghost, still living in the only place he'd called home at the end of his life. Maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that someone or something was in that unit, and they wanted to be left alone. I respected that, and I hope whoever's working there now does the same. When I was 17, I got my first real job working at a movie theater in the mall. It was one of those huge multiplexes with 20 screens, an arcade, and a full concession stand. The pay was minimum wage, but I got to see free movies, and the work wasn't too demanding. Plus, most of my coworkers were around my age, so it was actually pretty fun most of the time. I worked the closing shift on weekends, which meant I'd be there until midnight or sometimes 1 a.m., depending on how late the last movie ran. The closing crew was responsible for cleaning all the theaters, restocking the concession stand, counting the registers, and making sure everything was locked up before we left. There were usually 4 or 5 of us working the close, and we'd split up the theaters to make it go faster. The building itself was old, built sometime in the 1970s, and it definitely showed its age. The carpet was worn and stained, the seats were falling apart, and there were always weird smells coming from the ventilation system. But the worst part was the basement. The basement was where we kept all the supplies, extra inventory for concessions, cleaning equipment, old promotional materials, that kind of stuff. It was a maze of narrow corridors and storage rooms, all lit by these dim, flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed constantly. None of us liked going down there, especially not alone. There was just something off about it. The air was always cold and damp, and you'd hear strange noises. Pipes clanging, things shifting around, footsteps when no one else was down there. Management insisted it was just the building settling and the heating system, but it creeped everyone out. We had this unspoken rule that if you had to go to the basement, you take someone with you. One Saturday night in October, I was working the close with 3 other people. Jake and Maria, who were dating and always disappeared together instead of actually working, and this new guy named Connor who'd only been there a few weeks. Our manager, Steve, had left around 11 p.m. after the second-to-last movie started, leaving us to handle everything. By midnight, Jake and Maria had vanished somewhere, probably making out in one of the theaters, and Connor and I were left to do most of the work. I was annoyed, but not surprised. It happened pretty much every time we worked together. Connor was cleaning Theater 8, and I was working on Theater 12 when I realized we were out of garbage bags. The extra boxes were kept in the basement, of course. I radioed Connor and asked if he wanted to come with me, but he said he was almost done with his theater and would just meet me upstairs. I didn't want to wait for Jake and Maria to finish whatever they were doing, so I decided to just go by myself. I'd been down there plenty of times. It would be fine. I propped open the basement door so it wouldn't lock behind me and headed down the stairs. The lights were already on, which was weird because I was pretty sure no one else had been down there that night. But sometimes the opening crew would forget to turn them off, so I didn't think too much about it. I made my way through the corridors to the storage room where we kept the cleaning supplies. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and I could hear the usual sounds of the building. Pipes, ventilation, the distant hum of the HVAC system. I found the garbage bags, grabbed a box, and started heading back toward the stairs. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. I stopped and listened. The footsteps continued, getting closer. My first thought was that it was Jake or Connor maybe coming to help me carry stuff. But something felt wrong. The footsteps were too heavy, too slow. I called out, asking if anyone was there. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I stood there, clutching the box of garbage bags, my heart starting to race. Then I heard it again. The footsteps, but this time they were moving faster, like someone was running, and they were coming toward me. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I turned and ran back toward the stairs as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear the footsteps getting closer, echoing off the concrete walls. I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut behind me, my hands shaking. I stood there in the hallway, breathing hard, trying to calm down. After a minute, I slowly opened the door and looked down the stairs. The lights in the basement were off, all of them. I hadn't touched the light switch, and there was no timer. Someone or something had turned them off. I let the door close and locked it. I'd had enough. I found Connor and told him what happened. He looked at me like I was crazy, but I could tell he believed me. Everyone who worked there long enough had a weird experience in that basement. We decided to tell Steve about it the next day. When I came in for my next shift, Steve pulled me aside. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to have this conversation. He told me that I wasn't the first person to report strange things happening in the basement. Over the years, multiple employees had complained about hearing footsteps, seeing shadows, feeling like they were being watched. A few people had even quit because of it. Then Steve told me something that made my blood run cold. Back in the 1980s, one of the night managers had died in the basement. He'd been down there doing inventory after close when he'd had a heart attack. No one found him until the opening crew came in the next morning. His name was Marcus, and according to Steve, some people believed he never really left. Steve tried to play it off like it was just a story, but I could tell he believed it. He'd worked there for 15 years and had his own experiences. I kept working at that theater for another 6 months, but I never went into the basement alone again. And on nights when I absolutely had to go down there, I'd make it as quick as possible. I'd hear those footsteps a few more times, always when I was alone or when the basement was quiet. Once I saw a shadow move across the wall when there was no one there to cast it. The last straw came on a night in March. I was closing with a different crew, and we were running behind schedule. It was almost 2 a.m., and I still needed to grab some supplies from the basement. Everyone else was busy, so I went down by myself, against my better judgment. I was in the storage room, loading up a cart with supplies when the lights went out, all of them at once. I was plunged into complete darkness. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hands shaking. That's when I heard breathing, heavy, labored breathing, like someone who'd been running or was in pain. It was coming from right behind me. I spun around, shining my phone light into the darkness. There was nothing there. But I could still hear the breathing, and now I could feel cold air on the back of my neck, like someone was standing right behind me. I ran. I left the cart, left the supplies, and ran for the stairs. I didn't stop until I was back in the lobby with the lights and people. I told my manager I was done, clocked out, and never came back. I don't care if it was really a ghost or if there was some logical explanation. Whatever was in that basement, it wasn't friendly, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it wanted.